The day Lydia Callahan turned down a marriage proposal for the first time in her life. She was standing in the middle of a horse corral with mud on her boots and hay in her hair, and she did not feel a single moment of regret. It was the spring of 1878, in the small but stubborn town of Harrow Creek, Nevada, a place that sat at the edge of the high desert like a man squinting into the sun. The town had grown up along a dry creek bed that flooded every March, and left the main road a disaster of red mud that clung to everything it touched. There were 3 saloons, a general store, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, a blacksmith, a telegraph office, and enough ambition among its 400 residents to fill a much larger town. Harrow Creek was not a romantic place by any stretch, but it was a living place, a breathing, sweating, arguing, laughing place, and Lydia Callahan had decided long ago that she loved it more than anywhere else she had ever been. She had come to Harrow Creek 7 years earlier at the age of 22, traveling west from Missouri with her father, Patrick Callahan, who had chased the promise of a small cattle operation on land he had purchased sight unseen from a man innocent. Louis Railway Office. Patrick had turned out to be more of a dreamer than a rancher, but his daughter had made up for every ounce of his impracticality with twice the stubbornness and 3 times the capability. By the time Lydia was 25, she was running the day-to-day affairs of the Callahan spread herself, keeping the books, negotiating with buyers in Reno, and making sure the hands got paid even when the margin was thin. When Patrick died in the winter of 1876 from a fever that swept through the valley and took 4 others with it, Lydia inherited a modest ranch, a small herd, 2 reliable horses, a debt to the First Territorial Bank of Nevada, and a profound, settled determination to do things entirely on her own terms. She was 29 now, with dark copper-red hair that she kept pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat most days, green eyes that could cut a man down or warm him up depending entirely on his behavior, and the kind of face that stopped people mid-sentence without her ever trying. She stood 5 feet and 5 inches, and she carried herself like someone who had measured herself against every difficulty life had thrown at her, and found herself consistently adequate to the task. The man who had just proposed to her was Harold Gentry, who owned the feed and supply at the north end of Main Street. Harold was a decent man, 43 years old, twice widowed, with a good reputation and a genuine fondness for Lydia that had been growing in plain sight for 2 years. He had chosen the corral because he had come to help with the injured gelding that had thrown a shoe and twisted something in its foreleg, and he had stayed after the work was done, turning his hat in his hands with a kind of agonized nervousness that Lydia had seen coming for weeks. "I know you are independent, Lydia," Harold had said, his voice earnest and low. "I am not asking you to give that up. I am asking you to let me stand beside you. I am a good man, and I believe you know it." "You are a good man, Harold," Lydia had replied, without hesitation or cruelty, because she believed it entirely. "But I do not love you, and I am not willing to build a marriage on less than that. It would not be fair to either of us." Harold had nodded slowly, looked at the gelding for a moment, and then looked back at her with something that was not quite heartbreak but was close enough to it. "Is there anyone else?" he had asked. "No," she had said, and that had been the truth. There was no one else. There was only her land and her cattle and the staggering amount of work that every single day demanded of her, and somewhere deep in the private architecture of her heart, a door she had not yet opened and was not entirely sure she intended to open at all. She had watched Harold Gentry ride away down the long dirt road that led to town, and she had gone back inside to start supper, and she had not thought about it again for 3 days. Then Jedediah Donovan rode into Harrow Creek. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late April, on a buckskin horse named Canyon that was the most self-satisfied-looking animal Lydia had ever seen. Jedediah himself was 32 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark brown hair that had been bleached lighter at the temples by the sun, and a jaw that always seemed to carry a shadow of stubble, no matter how recently he had shaved. He had gray eyes that were the color of storm clouds just before they opened up, and a quality of stillness about him that made people pay attention when he finally decided to speak. He wore a worn canvas duster and a hat that had seen better decades, and he rode like someone who had spent so much time on horseback that stillness felt natural. He had come to Harrow Creek because he was looking for work. He had spent the previous 3 years as a drover on the long cattle drives north out of Texas, working the trails through New Mexico and Colorado, and he had decided that he was tired of driving other men's cattle across other men's land and sleeping under the sky for months at a time. He wanted to stop moving. He had heard from a man at a way station in Winnemucca that the Callahan spread west of Harrow Creek was looking to hire a capable hand, someone who could manage the seasonal work without needing to be told everything twice. He had gone directly to Sheriff Ambrose Cole, because that was what a man did when he arrived in a new town if he intended to stay honest, and Sheriff Cole had looked him over with the professional skepticism of a man who had seen every variety of human being ride through that particular stretch of Nevada, and told him that if Donovan could prove he was not a fool and not a drunk, Harrow Creek would receive him well enough. Then the sheriff had given him directions to the Callahan place. Lydia was mending fence at the south pasture when she first heard the horse. She looked up, one hand still holding the wire stretcher, and watched the rider come down the road with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who was not in a hurry but was not wasting time either. She did not recognize the horse or the man, and she set down the tool and waited. "Miss Callahan," he said, pulling the buckskin up short about 10 feet from the fence line. "I am she," Lydia said, "and I would ask that you do not call me miss. My name is Lydia." He blinked once, which she took as surprise that he absorbed without letting it rattle him. "Jedediah Donovan," he said, "I heard you were looking for a hand. I have been working cattle drives for 3 years out of Texas. Before that I worked 2 years on a spread in Colorado, and before that I came up on my family's farm in Kentucky. I know horses and cattle, I can fix most things that break, and I work harder than I look." Lydia studied him for a moment. "What do you charge?" $30 a month plus room and board." "I offer 28, room and board, and I am particular about the quality of work I expect in return. My previous hand left in February to go north to the mines, and I have been running short since then. If you drink on the job or if you take a short approach to anything, we will not suit each other." "I drink on Saturday nights in town when I have earned it," Jedediah said, "and I do not know how to do anything halfway. It is not in my nature." Something in the plain factualness of that answer settled something in Lydia that had been tense and impatient for 2 months. "Get down off that horse," she said, "and help me finish this fence. I will evaluate as we go." He got down without a word and picked up the second pair of pliers from the ground as though he had always known they would be there. They worked the fence until the sun started to drop behind the ridge to the west, and in those hours Lydia paid close attention to him. He worked steadily, without performing for her observation, asked 2 practical questions, and otherwise used the time to simply do what needed doing. When the last post was set and the wire pulled taut, she straightened up and looked at him. "You are hired," she said. "The bunkhouse is behind the barn. It is small but tight and dry." "That is all I require," he said. That was the beginning of it, though neither of them would have described it as the beginning of anything at all. The first weeks of May settled into a working routine that Lydia found, to her considerable surprise, genuinely comfortable. Jedediah was the kind of man who understood without being told where the edges of his territory were, and he respected hers. He did not ask personal questions. He did not offer opinions about her decisions unless she asked, and when she did ask, he gave them plainly and without softening them past usefulness. He was up before dawn every morning, and she could hear him in the barn before she had finished making coffee, and there was something steadying about that sound, the low murmur of a man talking to horses in the early dark. He ate supper at the kitchen table most evenings, because the practical reality of running a two-person operation on a working ranch made a separation of meals more ceremony than sense, and Lydia was not given to ceremony. They talked about the cattle, the condition of the pastures, the price of beef at the Reno market, the state of the water in the South Well. They talked about the weather, which in Nevada was always a subject of genuine importance. They talked about Harold Gentry's new shipment of wire, and the telegraph news from Reno about the railroad expansion, and the sermon that Reverend Mills had delivered the previous Sunday that had managed to offend 3 different families in 3 different directions. What they did not talk about was anything personal, and for weeks that was perfectly fine with both of them. Then in the middle of May, a man named Rulon Price came to Harrow Creek. Rulon Price was a land speculator from San Francisco who had been buying up small parcels throughout the Nevada high desert with the quiet, patient efficiency of a man who knew something others did not. He had connections with the Central Pacific Railroad, and the whisper in the territory was that the railroad was planning a spur line that would pass through or very near Harrow Creek, which would make every piece of land in a 20-mile radius suddenly worth 5 times its current value. Price was getting ahead of that valuation, and he was doing it by making offers to struggling ranchers that were just barely good enough to seem reasonable and just barely bad enough that a sharp person would recognize them as theft with paperwork. He came to see Lydia on a Tuesday, arriving in a rented buggy from the livery with a black coat and clean hands and a smile that was technically warm but did not reach his eyes. "Miss Callahan," he said, sitting across from her at the kitchen table with his hat on the chair beside him and his leather case open between them. "I represent a consortium of investors who have a genuine interest in Nevada land. I am prepared to offer you $1,100 for your full property and improvements." Lydia looked at the papers he had spread on her table as though they were a somewhat interesting insect. "My property is worth at minimum $1,800 at current market value," she said. "And that is before we discuss the likelihood that land values in this area are about to change considerably." Rulon Price's smile did not waver. "I admire a woman who does her research. However, you are currently carrying a debt of $420 to the First Territorial Bank. Your herd is under strength after a difficult winter, and you are operating with a single hired hand. Your position is not as strong as you might present it." Lydia felt a cold, clean anger settle through her. She recognized this particular type of man. She had encountered him before, in smaller doses, in letters and in town meeting rooms. He was the kind who used accurate information like a blade, not to help the person facing him, but to cut away their sense of standing until they felt small enough to accept whatever was offered. "I appreciate your time, Mr. Price," she said, standing, "and I will ask you to take your papers and go." He had gone, but his visit left a shadow over the following days. Lydia sat with her account book for 2 nights running, working the numbers with careful precision, and the truth was uncomfortable though not fatal. She was managing the debt, but only just. If anything went wrong this summer, a sickness in the herd, a dry spell that took the pasture grass, another hard winter, the margin would collapse. She did not speak of this to Jedediah, but he was not a man who was easily kept in the dark about things that concerned the operation he was part of. He had heard enough in town to know who Rulon Price was and what his methods were, and one evening after supper, instead of getting up and going to the bunkhouse as was his habit, he stayed at the table. "There is a man named Corcoran in Reno," he said, "who deals in cattle. He has a contract with the Army that requires steady supply through the fall. I drove cattle to him out of Colorado in 1875, and he is straight. If we can bring your herd up to 140 head before August, you could sell 40 at Army pricing, which runs higher than the open market, and clear your debt and then some." Lydia looked at him across the table. "You need to spend money to buy additional cattle before you can sell them at a better price," she said. "I do not currently have that kind of capital available." There is a man east of town named Gus Whitfield who is letting his operation go. He is moving to Sacramento to be near his daughter who just had a child. He has 60 head of decent cattle and he wants to sell them quickly and for a fair price rather than through a buyer who will lowball him. I spoke with him yesterday. He would accept $800 for the lot with half down and the rest at 60 days if the buyer was someone he trusted. And he would trust me. I told him about you, Jedediah said simply. He said yes. Lydia was quiet for a moment. She looked at the lamp on the table, the flame sitting perfectly still in the windless kitchen. "Why did you do that?" she asked. "Why did you go to Gus Whitfield and speak on my behalf without being asked?" He was quiet for a moment too, and she could see him choosing his words with the same care he applied to everything. "Because it was the right thing to do and I knew how to do it," he said. "I'm not trying to manage your affairs, Lydia. I'm trying to help you keep this place. There is a difference." She looked at him for a long moment, and something passed between them that was not yet anything nameable, but that would be, eventually, everything. "Set up a meeting with Gus Whitfield for Saturday morning," she said, "and thank you." The deal with Gus Whitfield was done by the end of May. He was a broad-shouldered, white-haired man of 60 who had the direct manner of someone who had never had the time or patience for anything other than plain speaking, and he and Lydia understood each other within 10 minutes. He accepted 400 down against the balance to be paid by the 1st of August, shook her hand with his enormous leathery one, and then looked at Jedediah and said, "You told me she was capable. You undersold her," and rode back east looking satisfied. June arrived with its long gold heat and its merciless sky, and the work on the Callahan ranch expanded accordingly. They were moving the larger herd between pastures now, managing water allocation carefully, and beginning the preparations for the August drive. The days started earlier and ended later, and there was a quality of purposeful exhaustion to them that Lydia, to her own surprise, found deeply satisfying. She had always worked hard, but she had worked hard alone, and working hard beside someone who matched her pace and her standards was something she had not known she was missing. They began to talk in the evenings about more than the cattle. It started with small things. One evening Jedediah mentioned Kentucky, the farm where he had grown up, the way the light came through the hills in autumn in a particular shade of gold that he had not found anywhere else. He talked about his mother, who had been a fierce and gentle woman who read poetry aloud at the supper table, and his father, who had died when Jedediah was 17 and left him the farm and his younger sister to look after. He had sold the farm when his sister married and moved to Ohio, and he had come west because west was where a man with no particular attachment to any one place eventually ended up. Lydia told him about Missouri, about her father's dreaming, and how she had loved him for it even when it made her life difficult. She told him about the crossing west, the 3 weeks of road and dust and broken wheel spokes, and the moment she had first seen the Nevada desert and felt, inexplicably, that she was looking at something that had been waiting for her. She told him about building the ranch up year by year, about the losses and the adjustments, about the winter her father had died and she had sat with the account book and the silence and decided that she was not going to fold. "Were you afraid?" he asked. "Terrified," she said. "But fear and surrender are different things. I have never had any trouble keeping them separate." He looked at her with those storm-gray eyes, and there was something in his expression that she could not quite read, something between admiration and a deeper, quieter feeling that he had not yet put into words even to himself. In the first week of July, a complication arrived in the form of a man named Jesse Price, Rulon's younger brother, who had come to Harrow Creek specifically to manage the land acquisition business personally, and with more pressure than his brother had applied. Jesse was younger and less polished than Rulon, with a temperament that moved faster from pleasant to unpleasant, and he made it known around town that he intended to own certain properties in the area before summer was out. He came to the Callahan ranch on a Wednesday with 2 men behind him on horses, sitting back from the main action in the way that suggested they were there for weight rather than work. "My brother tells me you are a stubborn woman," Jesse Price said from his saddle, not bothering to dismount. "I do not share my brother's patience." "I do not recall inviting you onto my property," Lydia said from the porch. She was calm, the way she was always calm when she felt actual danger, the way the air goes quiet before a real storm rather than a passing one. Jedediah came around the corner of the barn. He did not hurry. He walked with the same unhurried steadiness he brought to everything, and he positioned himself at the edge of the porch steps in a way that was entirely natural and entirely deliberate. Jesse Price looked at him for a moment, making the assessment men like him always made, and then looked back at Lydia. "$1,100 is still on the table. I will give you a week to think it over before the offer changes to something less comfortable." "The lady asked you to leave," Jedediah said. His voice was level and quiet, and it carried absolute certainty about how the current situation was going to resolve. Jesse Price looked at him again, longer this time, and then pulled his horse around and rode back down the road with his 2 men behind him. He did not look back. When they were gone, Lydia let out a slow breath. "Thank you," she said. "We should speak to Sheriff Cole," Jedediah said. "Yes," she agreed. "We will ride in tomorrow morning." Sheriff Ambrose Cole was 60 years old, leather-faced, and had the kind of authority that came entirely from experience rather than size or volume. He listened to what Lydia and Jedediah told him, asked 2 precise questions, and then leaned back in his chair with the settled look of a man composing the appropriate response. "Jesse Price has done this in 2 other counties," he said. "He has stayed on the legal side of things so far, but barely. I will make it clear to him that harassment of property owners is not something I intend to tolerate in this jurisdiction." He looked at Lydia directly. "You keep your books clean, you make your debt payments on schedule, and you do not give him any opening to make a case to the bank that you are unreliable. That is your best defense." "That is what I intend," Lydia said. Cole nodded. "Donovan," he said, looking at Jedediah. "You are a steady presence out there. I am glad you are where you are." Jedediah said nothing, but something in his face shifted slightly, and Lydia caught it. On the ride back from town, they passed through the low valley east of the ranch where the creek, running slow but clear in July, bent through a stand of cottonwood trees whose leaves were turning in the midday breeze with a silvery sound. Lydia pulled her horse up without planning to and sat looking at it. "My father loved this spot," she said. "He used to come down here on Sunday afternoons and sit on the bank and watch the water. He said it made him feel like everything was going to work out fine." Jedediah looked at the trees, the water, the light moving through both. "Did it," he asked, "work out fine?" "It worked out into something," Lydia said. "I am not certain fine is the right word, but it is mine and I would not trade it." He looked at her then, and the angle of the sun was such that her hair had escaped its pins slightly and was moving in the light breeze, and her face was tilted toward the water with an expression that was open in a way it rarely was. And Jedediah Donovan, without any intention of doing so, felt something slide into place inside him like a key finding its lock. He did not say anything about it. Not then. The cattle drive to Reno began in the first week of August, a modest enterprise as cattle drives went in 1878, just over 40 head moving north along the established trail with Jedediah on point and Lydia flanking with a young man from town named Cooper Briggs, who had hired on for the drive at $12, which was all Lydia could reasonably afford for the duration. Cooper was 19, rangy and capable and enthusiastic, in the way that young men are when the work feels like adventure rather than labor. The drive took 5 days in the heat and dust of the Nevada summer, camping at the water stops that Jedediah knew from his years on the trail, the kind of knowledge that cannot be purchased and cannot be faked, only accumulated through years of doing exactly what they were doing. The nights on the trail were clear and enormous, the Nevada sky so full of stars that it almost felt crowded, and they made their fires small and their sleep early because the cattle needed moving before the worst of the day's heat. On the third night, when Cooper had taken the first watch and Lydia and Jedediah sat on opposite sides of the low fire letting the coffee cool enough to drink, Jedediah said something he had not planned to say. "I have been here 4 months," he said. "I know," Lydia said. "I came here because I was looking for a place to stop moving," he said. "I think I have found it." Lydia looked at him across the fire. In the firelight his face was all shadow and warmth, and his gray eyes caught the flame and held it. "You mean Harrow Creek," she said carefully. "I mean the Callahan Ranch," he said. "I mean where I am right now." The silence between them was enormous and full, the way silences are when two people are standing on the edge of something and both of them know it. "Jedediah," she said, and her voice was not unkind but it was careful, the way her voice got when she was about to say something she had thought through. "I value you more than I can say. The work you have done here, the way you have done it, the person you are in all of this. But I am not a woman who does things by half measure, and I am not ready to think about what I think you are beginning to suggest." He was quiet for a moment. "I am not asking you for anything," he said. "I am just telling you the truth about where I stand. I will not pretend that is not the case." "I appreciate that," she said. "I do. And I will not push," he said. "But I am also not going to disappear or pretend to feel something different than what I feel, because that is not in my character." She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression was complicated and real, and a little frightened in a way she would not have admitted out loud. "Fair enough," she said finally. They reached Reno 2 days later, sold the cattle to Corcoran's agent at the Army pricing as promised, and Lydia walked out of the buyer's office with enough money to pay Gus Whitfield the balance she owed him, clear her bank debt, and still have enough left to carry the operation comfortably through the winter. She stopped on the boardwalk outside the office and looked at the figures on the receipt in her hand, and she felt something expand in her chest that was purely, cleanly relief. Jedediah was waiting with the horses. He saw her expression and understood it immediately. "We did it," she said. "You did it," he said. "I helped." She looked at him and laughed, and it was not a polite or managed laugh but a real one, full and bright. And he looked at her laughing in the Reno sunshine, and the feeling that had found its lock on that evening by the creek deepened into something he recognized as permanent. They celebrated that evening at the best dining establishment in Reno that was willing to serve a woman in trail clothes without making a scene about it, which was a restaurant on 2nd Street run by a woman named Mrs. Helena Park, who was originally from St. Louis and had no time for pretension. They had beef and roasted potatoes and the best cornbread Lydia had eaten since Missouri, and they talked for 2 hours over their meal in a way that had shifted from the comfortable practicality of their daily conversations into something warmer and more openly personal. Jedediah told her about a time in Colorado when he had gotten lost in a blizzard for 2 days and survived by finding a lined shack that was empty but dry, and had spent those 2 days reading the previous occupant's collection of dime novels by firelight and eating the man's emergency supply of canned peaches. Lydia laughed so hard at the image of this large, serious man, curled up with dime novels, during a blizzard that Mrs. Park looked over from across the room with an approving expression. Lydia told him about the time, 2 years after arriving in Nevada, when she had accidentally invited the wrong man to her father's birthday supper by mixing up 2 very similar names in town, and had found herself hosting a dinner party that included 2 men who were in the middle of a legal dispute over water rights, and had spent the entire evening strategically placing dishes between them to prevent direct eye contact. "Did it work?" Jedediah asked. "Mostly," she said. "One of them did throw a biscuit." He laughed, and it transformed his face entirely, and Lydia sat across the table looking at him and felt something shift in herself that she was not yet ready to name, but that she could no longer pretend was not present. They rode back to Harrow Creek the following day, Cooper Briggs having taken the stage home the morning after the sale, and the 2 days of riding were quiet in a different way than their earlier silences. The way a room is quiet differently after furniture has been moved into it. September arrived, and with it the beginning of the slow, golden descent of the Nevada autumn. The rangeland took on its harvest colors, the dry grasses going from gold to copper to a deep tawny brown, and the mornings came sharp and clear with a chill that made the coffee smell better and the horses move with more energy. Rulon Price's consortium made one more attempt at acquisition, this time through the bank, approaching the manager, a man named Theodore Holt, about recalling Lydia's debt prematurely on a technical interpretation of her loan terms. Theodore Holt, who was fundamentally a decent man, and who had watched Lydia Callahan manage her affairs with consistent integrity for years, declined to participate in this approach. He mentioned the attempt to Lydia directly in his office over tea with an expression of mild offense on his behalf. "I want you to know that the First Territorial Bank values your account and your custom," he said, "and that I have made it clear to the parties in question that their interference is neither welcome nor appropriate." "I am grateful, Mr. Holt," Lydia said. "He may try other routes," Holt said. "Men like that are persistent." "So am I," Lydia said. Jesse Price did make one more appearance, this time at the sheriff's office rather than at the ranch, accompanied by a lawyer from Carson City, and a document that made some claim about a disputed property line on the east side of the Callahan parcel. Sheriff Cole reviewed the document, called in the county surveyor, and within 2 weeks the surveyor confirmed that the claimed line was based on a map error from the original 1868 survey, and that the Callahan property boundaries were exactly as registered. Jesse Price's lawyer packed his papers and went back to Carson City, and Jesse himself left Harrow Creek the following week, and Rulon's consortium shifted its attention to other parcels in other places. When Lydia got the final word from Sheriff Cole that the matter was settled, she rode back to the ranch at a pace that was just slightly faster than usual, and when she got to the barn and found Jedediah reshoeing one of the work horses, she stood in the doorway and said, "It is over. They are gone." He set down the hoof he had been working on and turned to look at her. All of it," she said. "The property line claim is invalid, the debt is clear, they have moved on." He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "Good," and the way he said it held everything, all the weeks of quiet vigilance and steady presence and the particular quality of caring about something that belonged to someone else as though it were your own. "Good," she agreed. There was a pause, and she was still standing in the doorway with the September light behind her, and she said, entirely without planning to, "Jedediah, I think you should know that I am not unaware of what I feel." He waited. "I am just not sure yet what to do with it," she said. "You do not have to do anything with it," he said. "Not yet, not on any schedule other than your own." She nodded slowly. "You are a remarkably patient man." "Only about certain things," he said, and turned back to the horse's hoof, and she stood in the doorway a moment longer before going inside to start supper, and the whole exchange sat with her for days afterward, warm and complicated and growing. October brought a county fair to the neighboring town of Miller Flats, a day's ride east, and half of Harrow Creek made the trip in wagons and on horseback to participate in the livestock judging, the pie contest, the horse racing, and the general revelry that the end of the working season permitted. Lydia entered 2 of her best horses in the judging and agreed to go with her neighbor and closest friend, a woman named Ruth Alderman, who ran the town's millinery shop with her husband Frank. Ruth was 44, sharp-eyed, warmly outspoken, and had been watching the situation between Lydia and Jedediah develop with the focused interest of a woman who understood romantic tension and had strong opinions about what ought to be done about it. "You should ask him to come to the fair," Ruth said, on the morning they were preparing to leave. They were standing in Ruth's yard while Frank loaded the wagon. "He has work to do," Lydia said. "The cattle will survive a day without supervision," Ruth said. "Ask him." Lydia had not asked him, not directly, But when she went to the barn to get her horses and found Jedediah already there, saddling Canyon with the matter-of-fact efficiency she had come to know so well, she looked at him and said, "Are you coming?" He looked back at her over Canyon's neck. "I thought I would," he said, "if that is agreeable." "It is entirely agreeable," she said. The fair at Miller Flats was exactly what it was supposed to be. Loud and colorful and full of the particular energy of a community celebrating itself at the close of a hard-working year. Lydia's horses placed well in the judging, one of them taking a first-place ribbon in the working stock category that she accepted with genuine pleasure. She ate cider-fried donuts with Ruth and argued cheerfully about the pie judging and watched the horse race from the fence rail with her arms crossed and her eyes bright. Jedediah was beside her at the race, close enough that their arms were touching along the fence rail, and neither of them moved away. Cooper Briggs competed in the race on a spotted mare he had been training all summer and came in third, to considerable noise from his friends, and Lydia clapped for him, and Jedediah put 2 fingers to his mouth and whistled in a way that made Cooper grin across the field. In the late afternoon, when the fair was winding down and families were packing their wagons and the light was going deep and amber across the flat valley, there was music. A man with a fiddle and a woman with a guitar and another man with an instrument Lydia could not quite identify, but that produced a low, warm sound like the inside of something hollow and happy. People danced in the open space in front of the stage, couples and families and children spinning between the adults' feet. Ruth gave Lydia a very specific look. Jedediah looked at Lydia. "I am not a particularly accomplished dancer," she said, meaning it but also aware that she was offering an exit she did not entirely want used. "Neither am I," he said, "but I suspect neither of us is afraid of attempting things we are imperfect at." She laughed and he put out his hand and she took it, and they moved into the dancing. She had not been wrong about her dancing. It was functional rather than graceful. But his hands were sure, one at her waist and one holding hers, and she was aware of the warmth of him and the steadiness and the way he looked at her, not at the crowd or the musicians or the evening sky but at her, with an expression that was absolutely without pretense or performance. "You are looking at me like that again," she said. "Like what?" he asked. "Like you have made up your mind about something." "I have," he said. "I have been clear about that." "Jedediah," she said, and her voice was different now, softer than she usually allowed it to be. "Lydia," he said, matching her. They danced for 3 songs, and when the music paused between sets, they stood together at the edge of the dancing area with the evening coming down around them. And she thought about the 7 years she had spent in Harrow Creek building something solid and whole and entirely her own. And she thought about the last 6 months. And she thought about the fact that the thing she felt standing beside this man was not a threat to any of it but was, instead, something that lived in the same part of her that loved the ranch and the desert and the cottonwood trees along the creek. She did not say any of this. Not yet. But she kept his hand on the walk back to where the horses were hitched, and he did not comment on it, only held on carefully, as though he understood exactly how much was being offered, and exactly how much was not yet available. November arrived with its cold, clear days and its nights that could take your breath away, and the work on the ranch shifted to its winter character. Feeding and shelter maintenance, and the careful management of the herd through the harder months. They fell into the rhythm of it together, with the ease of people who have been working in partnership long enough to anticipate each other. One evening in the middle of November after supper, Jedediah cleared his throat in a manner that Lydia had come to recognize as the sound he made when he was about to say something he had been composing for a while. She set down her coffee and looked at him. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know that I have thought about it carefully, and I am asking because I mean it, not because I am impulsive or because I have not considered all the ways you might reasonably say no." Lydia felt something tighten in her chest, a mixture of anticipation and a very particular kind of readiness that was new. "Lydia Callahan," he said, with the quiet seriousness that was his most characteristic quality, I would consider it the greatest honor of my life if you would agree to marry me. I am not asking you to give up a single thing that is yours. I am asking you to let what is yours be also partly mine, and what is mine be partly yours. I am asking you to let me stay." She looked at him. The kitchen was warm and still, the lamp burning steadily between them, and outside the Nevada night was enormous and cold and clear. And she thought about every single day of the past 6 months, every practical conversation and every evening at the fire and the ride back from Reno with the receipt in her hand and the way he had said you did it, and every morning with the sound of him in the barn before she had finished her coffee. "I cannot say yes to that right now," she said. "I am sorry. I am not saying no because I do not feel what I feel. I am saying no because I need to be certain, completely certain, before I make a decision like this, and I am not there yet." He was quiet for a moment. His face did not collapse or harden, which was one of the things she found most remarkable about him. "I understand," he said. "You are not angry," she said. "No," he said. "I asked because it was true. The truth of it does not change based on your answer." She looked at him and felt something ache in her with a quality that was not comfortable but was also not bad, the way a muscle aches after genuine use. "You deserve more than this uncertainty," she said. "I am not uncomfortable with uncertainty," he said. "I have lived with it for most of my life. What I am not comfortable with is pretending I do not know what I want." "I know," she said. "And I respect that more than I can say." He got up from the table and put on his coat and went out to the bunkhouse, and Lydia sat at the kitchen table with the lamp and the cooling coffee for a long time, not unhappy exactly, but in the particular condition of a person who knows they are standing at a door they will eventually open and are simply not quite ready to turn the handle. December settled over Harrow Creek with its characteristic severity. The high desert winter was not gentle, and managing the herd through the cold required constant attention. They worked through it together, as they worked through everything, and the hours were long and the cold was sharp, and the satisfaction at the end of each day was deep and real. Christmas in Harrow Creek was observed with a Sunday service at Reverend Mills's church, and a town supper in the saloon that had the largest interior space, an arrangement that Reverend Mills himself had negotiated with the saloon owner, a pragmatic man named Bart Crowell, who cleared out the card tables and set up wooden planks across sawhorses, and contributed 2 enormous pots of venison stew to the occasion. The entire town came, or near enough to it, and the noise and warmth and crowding were a genuine pleasure after the cold and solitude of the working week. Lydia sat with Ruth and Frank Alderman, and Jedediah sat beside her, and the evening had a warmth to it that was not entirely explained by the number of bodies in the room. Reverend Mills said a short grace that was longer than he intended because he was that kind of man, and then everyone ate and talked, and the children ran between the table legs and someone produced a fiddle around 9 o'clock, and the board plank tables were pushed to the walls. Lydia danced with Frank Alderman, who was a surprisingly good dancer for a man who spent most of his days making hats, and then with Cooper Briggs, who had improved considerably since the fall fair. And then the fiddle player shifted into something slower, and the crowd thinned slightly, and Jedediah was standing at the edge of the floor and he looked at her. She went to him. They danced slowly in the crowded room of the Harrow Creek Christmas supper, and she let herself lean against him slightly more than she had at the fall fair, her head at the level of his shoulder, and he was warm and solid, and exactly where he had been every day for the past 8 months. "Jedediah," she said quietly, not pulling back. "Yes," he said. "I am not there yet," she said, "but I think I am closer." She felt him breathe. "I am not going anywhere," he said. "I know," she said. "That is part of it." January was the hardest month, as January in the high desert always was. A cold snap in the second week drove the temperature down to single digits for 4 days running, and they lost 2 head from the herd to the cold despite their best efforts, and the south pasture water trough froze solid twice in a row. They broke ice every morning together, working side by side in the gray pre-dawn cold with their breath clouding white around them. And the work was hard and necessary, and there was no space in it for anything but the doing of it. On a Sunday afternoon in late January, when the worst of the cold had lifted, and the sun had come out over the snow-dusted desert with a clarity that made everything look carved, Lydia went down to the cottonwood stand by the creek, the place where her father had sat on Sunday afternoons to feel like things were going to work out. She sat on the bank with her coat pulled around her and looked at the water moving slow and dark between the snow-edged banks, and she thought about her father and about the ranch and about what the past years had built her into, and she thought about the question that was still sitting on her kitchen table, patient and unanswered. She heard Canyon before she heard Jedediah, the horse's hooves quiet in the snow. She did not turn around. He came and sat beside her on the bank without saying anything, and they looked at the water together. After a while she said, "My father would have liked you." "What makes you say that?" he asked. "You are honest about what you feel without making it someone else's burden," she said. He admired that quality. He struggled with it himself. He would have liked meeting someone who had it naturally. "It is not always natural," Jedediah said. "Sometimes it is just what you decide to be because the alternatives are worse." She turned to look at him, his profile against the winter light, and she thought about the morning she had stood at the fence and watched him get down from his horse and pick up the pliers as though he had always known they would be there, and about every single morning since. "Ask me again," she said. He turned to look at her, and his gray eyes were very direct and very still. "Lydia Callahan," he said without hesitation, "will you marry me?" She looked at him for a moment that held everything she had ever been, all the stubbornness and the work and the love for this land and the grief of her father and the 7 years of building something alone and the deep, growing certainty of the past months. "No," she said. He blinked. A small, barely perceptible movement. "I cannot marry you today," she said, "because I want to do this the right way, and that means I need to tell you something first. I need you to know that what I feel is real, and it is not small. But I have refused 2 good men in my life because I was not willing to settle for less than certainty, and I will not rush into this even with you, perhaps especially with you, because you matter too much to me to give you anything less than my whole heart without reservation." He was very still. "I am asking you to wait a little longer," she said. "Not forever, not long, but I need to be ready in the way I need to be ready, and when I am, you will know it." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the creek. Then he said, "How long?" "Spring," she said. "When the creek floods and the mud comes back and everything starts again, that is when I will know." He looked at her for a long moment, and what was in his expression was not frustration or defeat but something that was, if anything, deeper and more certain than it had been before. "Then I will be here in spring," he said. "You will be here every day between now and spring," she said, not as a question. "Every single one," he said. She nodded, and they sat together on the bank of the creek in the January cold until the sun started to go down, and then they walked back to the ranch together. And it was, without either of them saying so, the most important walk of both of their lives. February and March moved with the particular texture of a season that knows it is carrying something important toward resolution. The work continued, as it always did, because on a working ranch in Nevada, the emotional life of its inhabitants was always conducted alongside the practical demands of the land and the animals, and there was something right about that, something honest. Love, Lydia had come to believe, was not a thing that existed apart from a life, but was a thing that existed inside it, woven through the daily work and the shared difficulty, and the small accumulated weight of ordinary days. She watched Jedediah through February and March with new eyes, or perhaps the same eyes she had always used, but with a different quality of permission in them, letting herself look at what had always been there without the cautious management she had previously applied. She noticed the way he talked to the horses, not in the performative murmuring that some men used as a kind of self-display, but in genuine, quiet communication, as though he found their company genuinely interesting. She noticed the way he helped Cooper Briggs, who had signed on for the winter season, without making Cooper feel instructed or diminished, offering what he knew as though it were simply available rather than superior. She noticed that he remembered small things, that she preferred her coffee without sugar, that the bay mare's left foreleg had an old sensitivity that needed watching, that she tended to get quiet when something was worrying her, and that the quiet was different from her usual quietness, and he knew the difference and gave her room. She noticed that when someone in town spoke badly of another person without warrant, a slight tension came into his jaw, and he would redirect the conversation without making a scene of it. She noticed that he gave a fair portion of his monthly wages, every month, to the church collection, even when the church was full of hypocrites, because he said the collection went to the families who needed it and not to the hypocrites themselves. She noticed that he laughed at himself easily and at others carefully, and that there was no meanness anywhere in him, not hidden, not occasional, not conditional. One evening in early March, Ruth Alderman came to supper with a pie in her usual direct manner and sat at the kitchen table with Lydia while Jedediah finished something in the barn and looked at her friend with the expression of a woman who has been keeping her counsel for longer than is comfortable. "You love him," Ruth said, not a question. Lydia was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I do." "Then what are you waiting for?" "The creek to flood," Lydia said, which made entirely no sense to Ruth and perfect sense to Lydia. The creek flooded in the third week of March, as it did every year, as it had done every year since long before Harrow Creek had a name or a population, as it would do every year after all of them were gone. The snowmelt from the mountains to the north and east came down through the valley in a rush of dark, cold water that turned the low ground into marsh and covered the main road in mud, and made the air smell like iron and earth and beginnings. Lydia stood on the bank of the flooded creek on a Thursday morning, watching the water run, and felt inside herself the settled, complete, absolutely certain thing she had been waiting for. It was not dramatic, which was how she knew it was real. It was not a revelation or an overwhelming. It was a simple, quiet understanding, the way you feel when you look at your own face in a mirror, not surprising, not new, just true. She went back to the barn. Jedediah was there, mending a piece of tack in the slow, careful way he approached everything that required precision, and he looked up when she came in and his face held its usual quality of patient attention. She stood in the middle of the barn floor and looked at him. "I love you," she said. "I am not asking you to propose again. I am not waiting for you to find the right words or the right moment. I am telling you that I love you and that I want to build a life with you, this life, here on this land, and that I am entirely certain and entirely ready and entirely yours if you will have me." He set down the tack. He stood up from the stool he had been sitting on, and he crossed the barn floor to where she was standing, and he looked at her for a moment with those storm-gray eyes that were no longer stormy but perfectly clear, and then he put his hands on either side of her face with extraordinary gentleness. "You are the most remarkable person I have ever met," he said, "and I have been yours since May." She laughed, and it was the same real, full laugh that had surprised him in the Reno sunshine, and she put her hands over his and stood on her toes and kissed him, and he kissed her back with all the care and certainty of a man who has known exactly what he wanted and has had the rare grace to wait for it. They told Ruth and Frank Alderman that same day, riding into town after the noon work was done. Ruth's response was an emphatic embrace that nearly knocked Lydia off her feet, followed by a very pointed look at Jedediah that said, "I have been waiting for this." And Frank's response was a handshake and a quiet, "Well done, both of you," that held genuine warmth. Sheriff Cole heard it the following day and came by the ranch to offer his congratulations, which he delivered with the brevity of a man who expressed approval through action rather than volume. "I am glad to hear it," he said, shaking Jedediah's hand and tipping his hat to Lydia. "This is a good thing." Theodore Holt at the bank, offered a formal and sincere congratulation the next time Lydia came in to make her monthly deposit, and added, without being asked, that the First Territorial Bank would be pleased to work with the Donovan Callahan operation on any future expansion plans. Lydia informed him that the ranch would remain the Callahan Ranch in name, and he nodded without any sign of surprise. "Of course," he said. They were married in April, on a Saturday afternoon when the mud from the flood had begun to dry into the particular red-brown of Nevada spring, and the air smelled of sage and new grass. The ceremony was held at Reverend Mills's church, which was small and full to overflowing with the people of Harrow Creek, who had apparently all taken a personal interest in this particular union. Ruth had insisted on contributing flowers from the garden she kept behind the millinery, early blooming things in yellow and white that she arranged in tin cans along the window ledges, and the effect was unpretentious and genuinely beautiful. Cooper Briggs wore his best shirt and sat in the front row with the expression of a young man at an important occasion, which it was. Lydia wore a dress she had made herself over the preceding 2 months, a deep green wool with white at the collar and cuffs, and she wore her hair down, which she almost never did, and she walked into that church with the bearing of a woman who has made her decision with complete clarity and has no uncertainty left in her body. And Jedediah Donovan stood at the front of it and looked at her coming toward him with an expression that Reverend Mills would later describe privately to his wife as the most purely honest thing he had seen in 20 years of conducting wedding ceremonies. The vows they exchanged were the traditional words, but when Reverend Mills reached the part about the couple saying their personal intentions, Lydia looked at Jedediah and said, clearly and without flourish, "I promise to be entirely honest with you because you have earned it and because it is the only thing I know how to give that is truly worth having." And Jedediah looked at her and said, "I promise to stay. Whatever comes, whatever is required, I will simply stay." The church was quiet for a moment after that, and then someone coughed, and then Ruth was crying in a thorough and unashamed way, and Reverend Mills concluded the ceremony with a slightly damp eye himself, and they were married. The spring that followed their wedding was one of the most beautiful that Lydia could remember, and she acknowledged to herself, without sentimentality, that she was seeing it differently than she had seen other springs, with the particular quality of attention that happiness lends to ordinary things. The desert in April and May was briefly, spectacularly alive, the dry ground producing its short season of wildflowers in purples and yellows, and the small bright reds that appeared along the creek banks, and the sky was the kind of blue that required no qualification. They continued the work of the ranch together, as they had done before, but with the new quality of a thing that has found its proper form. Jedediah formally invested his savings in expanding the herd, bringing the number to 160 head by midsummer, which was a scale that made the operation genuinely profitable for the first time since Lydia had taken it over. They hired Cooper Briggs permanently at a wage that was fair by any standard, and Cooper approached the permanence of his position with the gratitude of a young man who understood that good work and reliable employment were both rare and worth protecting. The partnership between Lydia and Jedediah in the practical work of the ranch was as good a thing as either of them had experienced in their working lives. They made decisions together in the way that people do when both have genuine competence and genuine respect for the other's competence, each contributing what they knew best, neither reducing the other. Lydia kept the books and managed the sales relationships and handled the bank and the legal matters and most of the relationships in town, because she was good at these things and because she had built them. Jedediah managed the cattle and the horses and the physical maintenance of the property and the relations with other ranchers in the valley, because these were his strengths, and he had come to know the land and the animals as thoroughly as anyone could in a year. When they disagreed, which they did, because they were both opinionated and neither was given to false agreement, They disagreed directly and without drama, and they resolved their disagreements either through persuasion or through the practical test of trying things and seeing what worked, and neither of them held a grudge past sundown because neither had the temperament for it. In the autumn of 1879, Lydia discovered she was expecting. She told Jedediah on a quiet evening in September, after supper, sitting at the kitchen table where he had asked her to marry him, and she had said not yet, and the lamp had burned steadily between them through all of it. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was very still and very full, and then he reached across the table and took her hand. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Well," she said, "surprised, though I suppose I should not have been, and something else I do not quite have a word for." "Something good?" he asked. "Something enormous," she said. "Not frightening, just very large." "We will manage it," he said. "We will do more than manage it," she said. He smiled, and it was the full, transforming smile she had come to know as something that came rarely and meant everything. And he brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips against her knuckles in a gesture that was more tender than anything she had expected from a man of his particular economy of expression, and she felt it from her knuckles to the center of her chest. The following months had the quality of a very purposeful season. Ruth Alderman arrived with her considerable knowledge of such matters, having had 3 children of her own, and assisted at the deliveries of a dozen others in Harrow Creek and the surrounding homesteads. She visited often and was forthright with information, and took a cheerful and matter-of-fact approach to the entire subject that Lydia found exactly suited to her own temperament. Jedediah built an addition onto the house that winter, a second bedroom opening off the main room, with a window that faced east toward the morning light, framed and fitted with the meticulous care he brought to everything structural. He also built, without being asked, a small wooden box with a fitted lid and tiny brass hinges that he left on the kitchen table one morning without comment, and when Lydia opened it, she found it lined with a soft piece of wool and realized it was the beginning of what would eventually become a cradle. "You are building the cradle in pieces," she said, when he came in from the barn that evening. "It seemed less presumptuous than arriving with a completed one," he said. She laughed and shook her head and kissed him in the warm kitchen, while the desert winter moved around the house outside. Their son was born in April of 1880, 1 year to the month after their wedding, in the deep spring hour just before dawn, with Ruth Alderman attending and Jedediah in the next room, in a state of quiet vigilance that Ruth later told her husband was the most intense stillness she had ever been in the room adjacent to. The boy arrived with a full voice and dark hair and the gray eyes of his father, and when Jedediah was allowed into the room and took his son for the first time, he held him with the same quality of careful, certain attention he brought to everything he cared about, and looked down at this new person with an expression that Lydia, exhausted and radiant and propped against the pillow watching them, thought was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "What shall we call him?" Jedediah asked, not taking his eyes off the baby. "Patrick," Lydia said, "for my father." He looked up at her, and what was in his face was everything. "Patrick Donovan," he said. "Patrick Donovan," she confirmed, and it settled into the room like something that had always been true. Patrick Callahan Donovan, as his full name was recorded at the church in the county office, grew into the kind of child that a particular type of good parenting produces: curious, direct, unafraid of hard work, and possessed of a natural warmth that was entirely his own. He had his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair, and by the time he could walk, his mother's habit of tilting her head to one side when she was thinking hard about something, which both his parents found endearing beyond their ability to express. The ranch continued to grow, not recklessly but steadily, with the kind of measured expansion that comes from people who understand that the land has its own pace and cannot be rushed beyond what it will comfortably bear. By the end of 1880, they had expanded their range slightly to the south, leasing adjacent grazing rights from a neighboring rancher who had moved to California, and the herd was holding strong at 180 head. Cooper Briggs, who had been with them for 2 full years now, had developed into a genuinely skilled hand and a person of real steadiness, and Jedediah treated him more as a colleague than an employee, which Cooper understood and responded to by working with a consistency and care that went well beyond what his wage strictly required. He had also, in the course of the fall fair of 1880, developed a notable interest in a young woman named Clara Morno, the daughter of a local farming family, and the way he looked at Clara had the dreaming, stunned quality of a young man for whom something enormous had recently become apparent. Lydia watched this development with enormous private satisfaction. "You should say something to her," she told Cooper one morning in what she intended to be a casual way. Cooper went slightly red. "She might not be interested," he said. "She is interested," Lydia said. "I have had coffee with her mother. Say something." Cooper said something, and Clara Morno said yes to a Sunday ride with the pleased, calm expression of a young woman who had been waiting for the question, and the town of Harrow Creek had another courtship to observe and comment upon. In the spring of 1881, the railroad spur that Rulon Price had been quietly positioning himself to profit from was officially confirmed to be running through the valley, passing within 4 miles of the Callahan Ranch, which was close enough to make access to the Reno markets considerably more practical, without being close enough to disrupt the daily running of the place. The land values in the area increased sharply, as had been predicted, and the Callahan Ranch's assessed value nearly doubled in the county records. Theodore Holt from the bank came out personally to inform Lydia and Jedediah of the assessment change, which he seemed to take considerable pleasure in doing. "I believe this qualifies as a thoroughly satisfactory outcome," he said, with the measured understatement of a man who knows how close it had come to a different result. "It does," Lydia said, and she and Jedediah exchanged a look across the kitchen table that held all of it: the Rulon Price visit, the Jesse Price intimidation, the careful months of keeping the debt clean, the Gus Whitfield deal, the Reno drive, the slow, steady building of something solid enough to endure. The following summer, Lydia was expecting again. She told Jedediah on an evening in June, this time without the component of surprise, with the settled warmth of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing and is glad of it. He took her hand across the supper table in the same way he had the first time, and Patrick, who was a little more than a year old and sitting on a blanket on the floor with a wooden horse that Jedediah had carved for him, looked up at the sound of the quiet and studied his parents with the interested attention of a child who does not yet have words for everything, but is assembling the picture. Their second child was a daughter, born in the cold clarity of February 1882, with her mother's copper-red hair and her father's unhurried quality of attention. They named her Catherine, for no one in particular but for the sound of it, which both of them liked, and which suited her from the first day. Catherine Donovan was, from the beginning, a person of considerable character. She had opinions from the earliest age at which opinions can be expressed, and she expressed them with a directness that made Jedediah smile behind his coffee cup and made Lydia recognize something uncomfortably familiar. Ruth Alderman, who was present at the naming and held the baby with practiced assurance, looked at the child's expression and then looked at Lydia and said, with complete satisfaction, "This child is going to run something." "She already runs us," Jedediah said. Cooper Briggs married Clara Morno in the spring of 1882, in the same small church where Lydia and Jedediah had been married 3 years before, with a somewhat larger audience because Clara's family was large and social, and because the occasion of a young hand from the Callahan Ranch marrying a local girl was the kind of thing that Harrow Creek considered itself entirely entitled to celebrate. Lydia and Jedediah sat in the 4th row with Patrick between them, the boy holding his father's hat, and studying the flowers along the window ledge with the same pleased attention his father had once given to a view of cottonwood trees in a September creek bend. After the ceremony, in the yard of the church with the May afternoon around them, Cooper came to find Lydia and Jedediah with Clara on his arm, and the particular glow of a man who cannot quite believe his own good fortune. "I want to say thank you," he said, looking at both of them, "for everything, for the chance and for the example." Lydia looked at him, this young man she had watched grow from an enthusiastic 19-year-old into a capable and decent person, and felt something that was adjacent to pride but warmer. "You did the work yourself," she said. "Not all of it," Cooper said, and looked at Jedediah in a way that Jedediah acknowledged with a slight nod. That evening, after they had ridden home and put Patrick to bed, and Catherine was sleeping in the small east bedroom, Lydia and Jedediah sat on the porch steps with coffee, watching the night come in over the desert. The air smelled of sage and the faintest trace of rain to the south, and the first stars were appearing over the ridge in the manner they always did in Nevada, not gradually but all at once, as though someone had decided it was time. "Cooper set the example," Lydia said. "I heard him," Jedediah said. "Is that something you think about?" she asked. "What we are an example of." He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was giving a question its full consideration. "I think about what I want to be an example of," he said. "For Patrick, for Catherine, for whoever else we might be in front of. I want them to see a man who stayed, and a woman who was worth staying for, and I want those two things to look like what they are, which is the best possible life I could have imagined." Lydia looked at the stars coming out over Nevada and felt the full weight and warmth of everything she had built and been given and earned and refused and eventually, inevitably accepted, and she leaned against his shoulder in the evening cool. "You know," she said, "when Harold Gentry proposed to me in the horse corral that spring morning, I thought I was protecting something by saying no, and I was protecting the space for this." "Do you think you always knew?" he asked. "I think I knew that whatever I was waiting for had a specific shape," she said, "and that I would recognize it when it arrived. I just did not know what form it would take." "A dusty cowboy on a self-satisfied horse," he said. She laughed. "Canyon is not self-satisfied. Canyon is profoundly self-satisfied," he said. She laughed again, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they sat on the porch steps in the Nevada evening, with the stars fully out above the desert and the sound of their children sleeping inside the house, and the cattle moving somewhere in the dark pasture with the low, comfortable sounds of creatures at rest, and the land that was hers and his and theirs stretching out into the night in every direction. And it was not romantic in the way that dime novels described romance. Not dramatic or perfumed or elevated, but it was something better than that, something true, something that had been built from the ground up with patience and honesty and the particular courage of two people who had both been alone long enough to know exactly what they were choosing and to choose it fully. The years that followed were the kind of years that do not resolve themselves into dramatic stories, but that accumulate into something richer than drama, the daily evidence of a life well chosen. The cattle operation continued to grow with the slow, deliberate pace of proper management, and by 1884 the Callahan Ranch was one of the better-regarded operations in the valley, known for the quality of its animals and the reliability of its people. Jedediah's reputation as a man of competence and straight dealing had spread through the ranching community of the region, and he served for 2 years on the County Cattle Association's management board, a role he performed without ceremony and with considerable effectiveness. Lydia expanded her relationships with the Reno buyers and began, in the mid-1880s, to advise 2 other small ranch operations in the valley on their financial management, a practical and informal arrangement that grew out of conversations at the general store and the town meetings, and that she approached with the same thorough competence she brought to her own books. She took no payment for this, partly because the financial situation of the ranches she helped was too tight for payment to feel right, and partly because she understood that being a reliable part of the community was its own form of investment in the place she had chosen and intended to remain. Ruth Alderman remained her closest friend through all of it, visiting on Tuesday afternoons when the millinery was closed early, bringing opinions and pastry in roughly equal measure. Frank Alderman's health declined somewhat in the early 1880s, a lung condition that required him to slow his work, and Lydia helped Ruth with the accounting for the millinery shop during a difficult year without making anything of it, because that was simply what was done. Patrick Donovan started school at the Harrow Creek Schoolhouse in the fall of 1885, and on his first day arrived at the schoolhouse door with his father's quality of composed self-possession and his mother's green eyes, carrying his slate and his lunch pail with the bearing of a small person who has been adequately prepared by competent parents. His teacher, a young woman newly arrived from Sacramento named Miss Alice Frayne, noted in her first-week assessment that he was a careful reader and a natural mathematician, and that he had an unusual quality of patience for a 5-year-old. "He reminds me of his father," Ruth said when Lydia told her this. "He reminds me of both of us at our best," Lydia said. "Which is better?" Jedediah, when told this, said nothing but looked quietly pleased in the way he did when something mattered to him that he was not going to make speeches about. Catherine started school 2 years later and was, as Ruth had predicted and everyone had suspected, immediately running things. She organized the younger children at recess with a directness that Miss Frayne found alternately impressive and challenging, and she had an opinion about the curriculum that she was willing to share, at length, with anyone who asked, and several who had not. Miss Frayne, who was herself a direct and capable woman, found that she liked Catherine Donovan considerably, which was the only reasonable response to someone that formidably herself at age 5. In the winter of 1887, Lydia and Jedediah had a third child, a boy they named Thomas, who arrived in December with his mother's red hair and an expression, from his very first hours, of deep and contented observation, as though he had come already prepared to study the world at his own pace. Patrick, who was 7, received his brother with a seriousness that made Jedediah laugh quietly in the doorway, and Catherine, who was 5, declared that she had wanted a sister but that Thomas would do, and then immediately devoted herself to his welfare with a proprietary warmth that never entirely diminished. Thomas grew into a quieter child than his siblings, the kind of person who notices everything and speaks when he has something to say, and is consequently listened to very carefully when he does. He had a quality of stillness that people who knew his father recognized, and a way with animals that his mother simply accepted as one of those things that arrive in a family without explanation. By the time Harrow Creek moved into the last decade of the century, the town had grown to nearly 800 residents and had the character of a place that had decided to last. The railroad spur had brought new business and new families, and the main street now had a proper hotel, a second general store, a doctor's office, and a newspaper that came out twice a week and covered local affairs with an enthusiasm that occasionally outpaced its accuracy. The schoolhouse had been expanded to a proper separate building. Reverend Mills had retired and been replaced by a younger man from Missouri named Reverend Carver, who was somewhat less given to inadvertently offending multiple families at once, and the First Territorial Bank had expanded its premises and hired additional staff. The Callahan Ranch had expanded too, with 2 additional parcels of rangeland that Lydia and Jedediah had acquired over the years at fair prices from neighbors who were moving on, and the operation now ran near 300 head and employed 3 permanent hands in addition to seasonal help. Cooper Briggs had his own small spread by now, adjacent to the Callahan Range, and he and Jedediah had a working arrangement about shared grazing management that benefited both operations and was rooted in the kind of mutual respect that came from years of working side by side. Clara Briggs had 2 children by 1890, a boy and a girl, and her children and the Donovan children were in and out of each other's homes with the comfortable frequency of families whose parents had chosen well in their friendships. On an evening in the late summer of 1890, 12 years after Jedediah Donovan had ridden down the Harrow Creek Road on his buckskin horse with his worn duster, and his hat that had seen better decades, Lydia and Jedediah sat on the porch steps in the same arrangement as that evening in 1882 after Cooper's wedding, coffee in hand, the Nevada night coming in over the desert. Patrick was inside, 15 years old now, and studying by lamplight for a school examination with the focused seriousness of a boy who took his work seriously, because his parents always had. Catherine was 13 and had been in animated correspondence all summer with a girl she had befriended at a county fair in Miller Flats, covering 3 sheets of paper per letter with her bold, clear handwriting. Thomas was 8 and had gone to bed early as he sometimes did, quietly and without complaint, carrying the small carved horse that had been his brother's first and was his now. "Do you remember," Lydia said, "when you told me that you had come to Harrow Creek looking for a place to stop moving and that you thought you had found it? At the fire on the cattle drive," he said. "Yes. You were right," she said. He looked at her in the way he always had, with the full, unhurried attention that had been his particular quality from the first evening she had noticed it. "So were you," he said. "I was right to wait," she said, "and you were right to stay." "I did not stay for any noble reason," he said. "I stayed because there was nowhere else I wanted to be." "That is the best possible reason," she said. She leaned against him as she had always done, in the evening on the porch with the stars arriving over Nevada in their sudden, decided way, and he put his arm around her. And the ranch stretched out around them in the dark, the land that was theirs in every sense of the word, bought and earned and worked and loved. And inside the house their children moved through the ordinary rooms of an ordinary evening, and the cattle were quiet in the dark pasture, and the creek moved somewhere in the cottonwood stand with its slow, dark sound. It had not been a simple story or a short one. It had been a story about stubbornness and patience, and the particular courage of a woman who knew herself well enough to wait for the right thing even when the waiting was difficult, and about a man who had understood that love was not a question to be pressed, but a presence to be offered, freely and without conditions, every single day. She had refused him the first time, at the kitchen table in November, because she was not ready and she knew it, and she would not give him anything less than her whole self. She had refused him the second time, at the creek in January, because she was almost ready and almost was not enough and he deserved certainty. The third time he had not asked. He had simply stayed, through the winter and into the spring, steady as the land itself, patient as the long Nevada light, until the morning she came to the barn and told him what she felt and what she wanted, because she had finally arrived at the place she had been walking toward, and when she got there, he was already present, exactly where he had said he would be. They sat on the porch steps until the coffee was cold, and the stars were fully established in their enormous Nevada configurations, and then Jedediah put his mouth to her temple, warm and slow and deliberate, the way he did everything. "Come inside," she said, and they went inside together, and the door closed gently behind them, and the desert night continued its ancient, patient work around the house that was theirs, and the Callahan ranch rested in the dark under the wide Nevada sky, solid and enduring and entirely alive.